Hello, everybody. My name is Graham Elwood. Welcome to the Political Vigilante. I've been spending a lot of time talking about the Jeffrey Epstein case. I'm very lucky here to have from Mint Press News, Whitney Webb. Whitney, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to talk to us.
Hey, no problem. Thanks for the invite.
So I as I'm sure you know better than anybody, the more you dig into this Epstein case, it is a insane rabbit hole. And
yeah.
it affects, like, it's to me, it's like sort of maybe the defining moment of what the ruling class, how they operate, what they're doing, because it just affects every aspect of this.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Actually, it's something that hasn't really gotten a lot of attention is that a lot of these intelligence connections that Epstein had, they connect to the same networks that are also responsible for our endless wars and a lot of other things going on. So it's definitely much bigger than just, the Epstein case. So I'm glad you have noticed that, and I hope other people have too.
Well, it's kind of hard to not notice it when Maxwell is unseen for 3 years and then just kind of randomly shows up reading a CIA book at an In-N-Out. Like, if that was not a sign, I don't know what. If that was in a movie, I would think, oh, this is bullshit. This is a poorly written film. It's too crazy.
Yeah, that's kind of how this whole past week or so has been since Epstein was found dead, right? It's all just been it seems like it's a B movie, but it's supposed to be real. So I guess the government is just way worse at covering stuff up now, or doesn't expect people to really even care. I guess it's also a pretty telling, really telling about the state of the mainstream media that it's just been willing to go along with a lot of this stuff too, and not think it's weird, even though anyone with a brain is like, this is insane.
It's unreal to me.
Right.
I mean, when they're like, the headlines were like, Epstein's gal pal spotted in Hollywood. I'm like,
serial child rapist and sex trafficker spotted in LA would have been a better headline. Yeah.
A little more
gal
accurate.
pal. Yeah. That's insane. Yeah. Gross.
It's like, literally, it's like, oh, Taylor Swift's new beau. It's like unbelievable. It's and we'll get into it a little later, like how you cover this emotionally, because it's something I sort of wrestle with. But let's talk about, as we uncover this more, and clearly there's CIA. We hear stuff about the CIA. We hear stuff about Mossad. Obviously, the royal family's involved, so maybe it's MI6. Why don't you give us a little history lesson on how this pedophile sex trafficking and the intelligence community, what that history is?
Okay, so this type of operation, or whatever you want to call it, it really was first pioneered by the American mob back in the 1930s. And then when the precursor to the CIA first popped up in World War II, they made an alliance with that same mob, specifically the one led by Merrill, the National Crime Syndicate. They made a formal alliance with them, even though it was covert. It's called Operation Underworld, if anyone wants to go look it up. And that was supposed to be just out of wartime necessity, right? But that alliance with the mob continued and grew substantially by the 1960s, when they started using members of the mob for CIA assassination teams, specifically in relation to efforts to overthrow Fidel Castro in Cuba. But even back in the 1940s, when the precursor to the CIA was around, which is the Office of Strategic Services, or the OSS, Mayor Lansky and William Donovan, who was the OSS director, they were sharing blackmail about J. Edgar Hoover, because Edgar Hoover was trying to get blackmail on William Donovan because he wanted the OSS to not survive past the war. He was afraid that a permanent OSS, or what became the CIA, would challenge the FBI's power. So the mob and the CIA sort of engaged in the sharing of blackmail, the sharing of compromising photos and all of that had been taken of Hoover, and obviously realized their value to the CIA's covert operations. And so this really got out of control after this initial period, and proliferated to a massive extent. And it really got underway for political purposes domestically in the early 1950s as part of the anti-communist crusade. This was done by a businessman who was really close to Mayor Lansky named Louis Rosenstiel, and he was involved in running a pedophile sex ring for political or for sexual blackmail purposes with Roy Cohn, who was then general counsel to Senator Joe McCarthy. And J. Edgar Hoover was also present there because I guess he realized he was already compromised and wanted to be. He was also known for his extreme interest in acquiring large amounts of blackmail on friend and foe alike, Hoover was. And so he appears to have gotten at least some of that blackmail from this operation. Hoover also had a lot of really close, had a really close relationship and friendship with Rosenstiel and Cohn. And I document this pretty extensively in my reports, but one example would be that Louis Rosenstiel gave one of Hoover's top aides the #2 position at his giant liquor empire, which was called Schinley Liquors, gave him like this 6-figure salary and a bunch of stock options. And they would write all these letters and exchange flowers and gifts and all this stuff. And that was just the public face. In private, we know that this was going on. And we know this from court rulings, the early 1970s New York state congressional investigation on crime. We know it because Roy Cohn actually admitted it to the face of a former NYPD detective that was in charge of the human trafficking division for the NYPD. Apparently because Roy Cohn knew that he was so unaccountable. This may sound familiar with Ghislaine Maxwell, right? He knew that he was so that no one could hold him to account, that he was so protected that he just admitted it to the face of this top cop in New York, that he was trafficking little boys. He openly said that to this guy. The guy's name is James Rothstein, is the name of that detective, and he's talked about this a few times over the years. So given that, that was known to be going on, and actually, Roy Cohn is known for also being a mentor to Donald Trump and Roger Stone. Before any of this came out, Roger Stone, when he was talking about and remembering Roy Cohn, just offhandedly said, yeah, he was always surrounded by young blonde boys. Like that was like no big deal. So there's been, corroborating evidence of this going on. No. Roger Stone said Roy Cohn, who was a mentor to Roger Stone, was always surrounded by young blonde boys. The people that were around Roy Cohn knew that this was going on. So at the same time Roy Cohn was doing this, he was doing this from the 1950s into the 1980s. By the late 70s, there were several of these operations going on in connection with the CIA. Roy Cohn was also really close to former CIA Director Bill Casey, and a lot of other people connected to Casey and the U.S. intelligence apparatus during that time that was involved in Iran-Contra were also really involved in a lot of these that involved the trafficking of children and the sexual abuse of children for the purpose of political blackmail purposes, specifically trying to set up powerful people and film and record them. And we see a lot of overlap between that network and Epstein. We can get more into that later. But some of these cases came out over the years. They include the Franklin scandal. They include the ring that was run by Craig Spence, who was a Washington lobbyist that took his call boys, as the press called them, into the White House for midnight tours that were arranged by Donald Gregg, who was former National Security Advisor, George Bush Sr., and was actually a close friend and former work associate of Bill Barr, our current Attorney General. So there's a lot of really messed up stuff here. But I'm trying to show in my reports that this is the network that Jeffrey Epstein was connected to, plus the bonus of having one of his main co-conspirators having deep family ties to Israeli intelligence, Mossad. It's worth pointing out that the same organized crime syndicate that developed this methodology, I guess you could say, close with the CIA, was also really closely tied to Israeli intelligence from the very beginning of the founding of the State of Israel, and that's continued into the present as well. And some of the families that have been associated with this crime syndicate also are both oligarchs in the United States and in Israel, and are major donors not only to American politics, but Israeli politics. And some of them are longtime backers of Netanyahu, for example. And a lot of these donors are in this group that I talk about in my third piece called the Mega Group. And one of the co-founders of that is Leslie Wexner, who is Jeffrey Epstein's main, financier.
Okay, so let's focus on this, the third part of the article that I don't know you're going to have a fourth part that's coming out soon, but let's focus on this Mega Group and the ties to Mossad and Israel and all of that, and that you've uncovered thus far.
Okay, so the mega group, several members of it, they have direct ties to organized crime, specifically Mayor Lansky's National Crime Syndicate. One member, for example, would be Michael Steinhardt. His father was actually Mayor Lansky's personal dual fence, and he served 5 years in Sing Sing prison because he was so deeply connected to the mob. Some other people that are in the mega group that have mob connections are people like Max Fisher. He used to be associated with the Detroit Purple Gang, and he is considered a mentor to Leslie Wexner. Leslie Wexner, I want to talk about for a little bit. He was a co-founder of the mega group, and he also, in part 4 of my report, I'll be talking about how he was tied into the CIA a little bit as well. But Leslie Wexner, in a 1985 police report that was highly suppressed and came out by accident as part of a public records request in the late 90s, a lawyer that was representing his company, The Limited, in 1985, was killed in broad daylight, like shot twice in the head in front of an apartment. And that homicide is still technically unsolved, but what this suppressed police report shows is that the day he was shot, the next day he was supposed to testify in front of a grand jury about tax evasion and tax shelters. And at that time, this author, whose name was, whose name was Arthur Shapiro, he was representing Wexner's company, The Limited, and was ostensibly about to spill the beans on Leslie Wexner's shady financial activities. And it's interesting that same year is the year that Wexner meets Jeffrey Epstein, who then begins to fix Wexner's tangled finances. At least that's what mainstream reports from the period say that he was doing. But we know that Epstein was really involved in a lot of shady financial activity, money laundering, fraud, and all of that. So I think it's interesting there. But that police report also says that Wexner was deeply tied to the Genovese crime family, which is the other half of the National Crime Syndicate. And at the time that came out, the head of that was Tony Salerno, who was actually his former longtime lawyer, had been Roy Cohn, who I just mentioned a little bit earlier. So it's all this, there's a lot of interconnections connections among people in this network. Also, Leslie Wexner was the main force behind Southern Air Transport's relocation from Miami, Florida to Columbus, Ohio, where the Limited's based. Southern Air Transport is a well-known CIA front company that was involved in Iran-Contra drug running, other things like that. And Epstein was also involved in the move to Ohio. And given what we know about Epstein, and also Wexner's accused of raping Epstein's victims as well, it's very possible that there may have been a human trafficking dimension there as well, given that this airline was known to traffic drugs and arms with pretty much complete impunity, and this was in the early and mid 1990s. So there's a lot of strange connections there. Also, Epstein himself in the early 1980s. According to Vicky Ward, right, who's a journalist that's covered Epstein for a while, claimed to have been a financial bounty hunter, and that one of Epstein's clients was Adnan Khashoggi. Adnan Khashoggi was on the payroll of the Mossad during this time, and he was also involved as one of the main arms dealers in Iran-Contra. And then after that, right, as I mentioned, he gets involved with Wexner and then the CIA airport and all this stuff. And there was a British journalist who in 2001 did a big report on Epstein and claimed that Epstein had previously worked for the CIA. And I interviewed an Ohio journalist today who told me that Ohio's state inspector general and the Franklin County Sheriff, which is the county where Columbus is, had believed that Epstein and Wexner were both working with the CIA during this time. So based on that, I really think what Epstein was doing was a joint CIA-Mossad op, and I say Mossad mainly because of Ghislaine Maxwell. Her father, Robert Maxwell, was a known Mossad operative, was very deeply involved in the theft of the Promise software. But that theft of the Promise software by Israeli intelligence. Israeli intelligence put a backdoor into that software. It was sold all over the world to as many as 80 intelligence agencies and a bunch of banks. That was done in direct collusion with people in the Reagan administration. Actually, it was an envoy from the Reagan administration to Iran, and later I think a good friend of Ed Meese, who was an attorney general, an American, basically gave the software to Israel for them to put a back door in it. And he was never accused or convicted of treason, which is quite, shocking. But basically, there was a lot of overlap between people in the Reagan administration, the CIA and the Mossad during this time when all of Iran-Contra was going on. Israel was very much at the center of that. what this network is really an outgrowth of these CIA, Mossad, and organized crime associations that have been going on for decades. And Ghislaine Maxwell specifically, I think it's pretty clear that she took over her father's portfolio, as it were, with the Mossad after he died, because before his death, she was really involved in a lot of the meetings he was involved with and a lot of the events where he had a lot of these powerful Israeli and American politicians on his yacht, for example, that was named after Ghislaine Maxwell, and was very much involved in, a lot of his financial activities, including his fraud at the Daily Mirror Media Group, which was actually purchased by Maxwell with money from the Mossad. So, there's a lot of involvement here of intelligence agencies going way back. And I think the fact that mainstream media has pretty much avoided this whole intelligence angle, despite the fact that I've been able to dig all this stuff up, with public records and the internet and interviews, is pretty telling that, this information's out there, but there's a lot of people in corporate media that don't want it to get out.
Well, I mean, that's the thing. I mean, there's so many issues to touch on here. First of all, I've heard, and it sounds like this is what you're saying, is that, Epstein had this sort of fake hedge fund, and when he would get some of these powerful people, they'd come over and he'd say, you'll get a massage from a beautiful young woman, and the person would be a child, and they'd have videotapes.
Yeah.
And then those people would then, the leverage Epstein would use is then say, okay, well, invest in my hedge fund, and that's how he extorted them, right?
Well, that's like the official story, right? But from all appearances, he wasn't actually a billionaire, and his hedge fund apparently did not exist because no one on Wall Street ever traded with it or knew what it was. And his only client was Leslie Wexner, his only publicly admitted client. He was supposed to have made a bunch of money off a Ponzi scheme in the late 80s, but I really don't think that he would have been able to have, expanded and that money. I don't think it would have lasted from like 1987 all the way up to, 2003 or 2007 or whatever. I think a lot of this came from Wexner personally, from what I've looked into.
And so as we look at, when they denied his bail, Jeffrey Epstein's bail, I said, well, he's going to get killed in prison. That was my just first instinct. They're going to kill him.
That's what a lot of people thought, and they were right.
And so then I've heard some people, though, say, and I don't like chasing the conspiracy theories. I really like dealing in facts. Mm-hmm. But some people have said, oh, if he was an intelligence aide, if he was a CIA operative or asset, they could have extracted him out of there and he's still alive.
Yeah, I think that's possible. It really comes down to how important Epstein really was, which is hard to know. It's a lot of times, like for if an agent or an operative or someone connected to intelligence or an asset, whatever you want to call them, whatever role they play, if they become a liability, sometimes it's easier to take them out. But if they are really high value and and much higher in the hierarchy, right, then there has been the historical precedent of them being extracted as well. So it really comes down to how important was Epstein to these people, and it's really hard to know that. But the fact that this entire investigation and like cover up really, and all this deaths, the facts about his death and all this stuff, there are so many questions that really anything is possible at this point. And when you throw in the element of intelligence agencies, I mean, that's just a wild card, really, because they're capable of so much stuff, and then they act with like complete impunity, So it's like, if they wanted to extract him, and if they did swap him out, if that's true, I mean, no one would never know about it. They just cover it up and deny it, and the mainstream media would just roll with it. You know what I mean? So if they wanted to do that, they probably could have gotten away with it. But because of the lack of like actual honest factual reporting on this, and the lack of credibility the Justice Department has here, make it really hard to know exactly what happened, because of course the Justice Department right now is headed by Bill Barr, who is super connected to this network. He used to work for the CIA, pardoned all the Iran-Contra people. His old law firm represented Epstein in 2007 and negotiated that sweetheart deal. And one of the things that Bill Barr did for the CIA, he used to work for the Office of Legislative Counsel. He was working there during the Church Committee, which was investigating the CIA, and he stonewalled the Church Committee at every turn. And one of the things he tried to keep from coming out was the CIA's use of sexual blackmail operations. So, I mean, the fact that this guy is in charge of this investigation is completely insane. It's completely insane.
Yeah, it just shows you how awful and corrupt the ruling class is. Is just like I always say, there's not two parties in this country. There's two classes. There's the ruling class and everybody else. And the elections and the Democrat Republican is just professional wrestling. I mean, that's all it is.
Yeah.
And I look at this. So the thing that I thought when all those documents on August 9th got unsealed, and then Epstein was dead the next day, that the thing I was, and some people pointed out, well, now that he's dead, he can't contest how the evidence was gathered. And I said, okay, that sounds great from a legal standpoint if he was a regular person and we were dealing with Black Book was filled with regular people. It's not a bunch of like working class accountants in his pedophile, sex trafficking Black Book. So,
well, here's the thing that Epstein's death did. It made that criminal case go away, which means that all of the evidence that was acquired during discovery, the raids of his stuff, none of that is going to be made publicly available unless someone else is charged. So unless Ghislaine Maxwell or Wexner are charged in this case, none of that information is ever going to be made public. So that's what Epstein's death really did, and no one's talking about that.
There you go. That just explained why they killed him or why he's extracted or whatever, because now I knew it. I was like, what's going to happen to all this evidence? And so you just explained it.
It doesn't come out unless someone else is charged, and that's why Leslie Wexner has lawyered up and basically tried to distance himself as much as possible from Epstein. And Ghislaine Maxwell is nowhere to be found. And as you know, they're treating her like she's Carmen Sandiego, basically, like she's here, she's there, even though the NSA spies on everyone, they know where she is. So it's totally insane for them to be like, I don't know where she could possibly be. I mean, that's complete crap.
So how did you interpret her? I mean, this is how I interpreted her reading that book, was basically saying, to me, what it said was like, you can't catch me. I'm free. And anybody, especially because we're getting a lot of Hollywood names are getting linked to this. To me, I felt like she was saying, because she's so arrogant and she's pure evil. She's pure evil. Is that she was saying, anybody out there with evidence, keep your mouth shut.
Yeah, well, a lot of people think the book she was reading was a message in particular. I honestly think it's possible the photo was staged because it was an anonymous photographer. No one knows when it was taken. It could have been taken weeks ago. It could have been taken months ago. I mean, who knows? Plus, the New York Post is owned by Rupert Murdoch, who is super well connected into this whole network. He was actually a close personal friend of Roy Cohn, and Roy Cohn actually introduced Rupert Murdoch to Ronald Reagan, right? So I don't, take anything that comes out of there with a grain of salt, right? But I think ultimately what it was just a big FU to everyone that actually cares about this case and that cares about the victims, that she's showing that she thinks she's, she's not going to be held to account. And I really hope that's not true. But, given how the U.S. government works these days, she may be right. The reading of the CIA book, I think some people think that may have been a message to the CIA. I think, if this was a joint CIA Mossad operation, which I'm inclined to believe Ghislaine was the Mossad half, and there's a long history with the exception of Jonathan Pollard, which was in the 1980s. But any sort of, case of Israeli espionage from the 90s forward has really gone unprosecuted, even when it's been uncovered. Including, actually it was like Netanyahu, for example, who first got the Lewinsky tapes with Clinton. And there's been a lot of really aggressive Israeli espionage against the United States. The NSA in 2013 said they were the third most aggressive spy agency targeting the U.S. behind China and Russia. And they're supposed to be our ally. So basically, if she is the Mossad half, I personally think that she's saying, well, I'm not going to be held accountable. The CIA part, Jeffrey Epstein, got whacked or whatever, but I'm still here and you can't touch me. That's sort of what, I assumed it to mean, at least the book. But that's only assuming, if that was actually taken at that time and if this wasn't staged BS. I mean, it's really hard to know because of how manipulative the U.S. media is.
Oh, yeah. It's so manipulative. I mean, you saw it immediately, that morning, ABC was like, he committed suicide. They didn't even ask the question.
Yeah.
Just,
Yeah, and now everyone's running with it. Even the Miami Herald that broke these stories about Epstein last year is just saying, yeah, suicide, nothing weird. The conspiracy theories, they need to stop, you know? It's just, it's nuts. Because even the mainstream media over the past week didn't have its story straight. Like half the stories that came out of mainstream media were like, he was murdered, and the other half were like, it was suicide, you know? Like there was that story in CBS that was like, there was shrieking in his cell the morning he died, you know? And there were people saying, oh, the bone that was fractured was, you know, it was strangulation. And the day he was found dead, the Washington Post said people close to Jeffrey Epstein think he was murdered. So the fact that the mainstream media didn't even have their story together is, I think, really telling. And now they're telling all of us, like, peons or whatever, to get in line and say whatever they're saying, and they don't even know what the heck they're talking about.
Oh yeah, we're just lumped into these online, you know, tinfoil hat. They're putting
Yeah.
us in the, like, we're flat earthers or something crazy. Like we're just, that's where.
Yeah, lump them all in together. You know, anyone with legitimate questions, it's all crap. Yeah, it's just it's really frustrating for anyone that actually cares about this case. And no one, what I think is really telling is that no one in mainstream media has interviewed like the victims to ask what they think about anything, except a handful. You know, the day he died, what they thought. But there haven't been any like pieces I've seen devoted to asking them anything. They've just sort of been peppered in there. So that really tells you, you know, what the focus of this is and how they've turned this into a media spectacle, like you've said earlier, where Ghislaine Maxwell is the gal pal, yeah, when she's been accused of, you know, basically procuring these girls and being arguably like the brains behind this whole operations. Wexner was the cash behind it, and they're both, you know,
she's also raped them too. She wasn't just grooming them. There's those.
Yeah, and Wexner did too. Wexner was accused by the victims of you know, of raping at least 7 times.
Why? That's the thing. When these documents became unsealed from those civil cases, why wasn't the mainstream media just pouring over all 2,000 documents and showing this and this and this? They're just sort of leaving it for people like us to spend all this time on.
Yeah. And then they discredit us and smear us and say we're crazy and we're the conspiracy theorists. So that tells you a lot about how they're operating and where they're coming from. Actually, over in the past few days, the most recent article I saw on Leslie Wexner was a press release from JTA, which is the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, and they were just basically, it was like a PR announcement basically saying Leslie Wexner never knew anything Epstein did, and he's super bad, and Wexner was just deceived because, you know, Epstein was so charming. And I just want to point out, this is complete crap. Maria Farmer, who's an artist, was contracted by Epstein to do art at Wexner's mansion in Ohio in 1996. Epstein tried to rape her. She called the police, and it was Wexner's personal security that would not let her leave, even though she feared for her life for like 12 hours. So tell me the guy didn't know what was going on. I mean, that's just so insane. Plus, the other thing of the story with Wexner is that a lot of people do acknowledge that's where this New York penthouse, that's the largest private residence in Manhattan, that came from Wexner, and he gave it to Epstein for $1. Like in, I forget exactly what year, but like in the mid 2000s. But Epstein had been living in that about from 1994 on. It was originally bought by Leslie Wexner in 1989. Wexner installed like CCTV and all the spy recording equipment, this weird bathroom lined with lead under the stairs, and these hidden cabinets that would have like all the spy recording equipment in it. Lived in the house, and then he gives it to Jeffrey Epstein after spending all these millions of dollars buying a house and refurbishing it with all this weird electronic spy equipment, and then gives it to Epstein, and he is now acting like he doesn't know what was going on. I mean, it's just insane that the press is rolling with this, because these are reports from the New York Times I'm talking about right now from 1996 and the mid 90s that talk about all of this. So the fact they won't report on it now tells you a lot.
Well, for me, it's like I really kind of feel like I'm not going to let this go. Like I feel
no, we can't let this go. I mean, if people aren't outraged by serial, you know, sex traffickers and child rapists getting off, but people, you know, go to prison for how many years for pot still in most states? I mean, are we really going to put up with this? I don't know. So I'm not going to let it go. And there's so many connections. Even though I'm just doing a 4-part series, there's a lot of spinoffs I have lined up with some other people I'm going to be collaborating with. This network, you know, goes to the top. These aren't the same people just sex trafficking. They're also arms trafficking. They're drug trafficking. They're getting us into endless wars. You know, a lot. Like Wexner was super involved in trying to sell the Iraq War, actually, in 2003. And not just talking about him, but, the intelligence agency, that Iran-Contra group, those are the neocons. That's where the neocons came from. That's them. And they're still around. And they're in the Trump administration right now.
Of course.
So, people need to see this in the bigger picture, that, the ruling class responsible for all this horrible crap, they're the same group. And this is some of the stuff they do for fun.
Right.
And for blackmail. It's a mess. It's a mess. So we can't really let this go, because if this doesn't make us mad, I don't know what the heck people will get mad about.
I know. And it's just like, so do we want to have victims continuing to be created? I mean, like, this is horrifying. What you hear, all of these victims, that, like, who's going to speak up for them? William Barr? I mean, it's
yeah, well, one thing the mainstream media also hasn't done is that most of the victims that they've given, that they've actually interviewed or talked to, it's mostly like, most people know the faces maybe of like 6 girls that were abused by him. He's believed to have thousands of victims. Thousands of victims.
It's horrifying, but it's like, I say, who's in that black book? Is it the head of Disney that owns ABC? Is it the head of Google? Is it, it's probably those people are in these books, which is one of the reasons, and they control all the media, they control the narrative, so they can just say, oh, I go, when Epstein died, I go, if they don't stick to the suicide thing, there'll be some Jack Ruby type lone wolf that killed them, some some lifer convict that just couldn't handle it anymore, was trying to, some bullshit that they're going to try to sell us. And Epstein acted alone, and none of not Wexler, no. Bill Clinton was only on his plane 4 times, even though there's 26 flight log. Like, the blatant lying is unreal to me, and the media won't say a goddamn thing about it. Like, Ghislaine Maxwell, Chelsea Clinton's wedding.
Yeah. Well, actually, something that's really crazy that's going to be in part 4 of my report is that a lot of media reports have said that the Epstein-Maxwell-Clinton relationship only began after Clinton left office. Actually, as soon as Bill Clinton was president, Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein were attending donor dinners for Bill Clinton. This goes back way further for the Clintons. And actually, the Clintons were also really close to this Iran-Contra intelligence network back when Bill was governor of Arkansas. There was a lot of drug running and Contra training going on at the Mena Airport in Arkansas and nearby there. So, these are all part, you can say Democrat, you can say Republican, but these guys are all part of the same sleaze. I mean, and this is what, they're okay with doing for the purposes of gaining power. They abuse thousands of children and ruin their lives for more power for them, and they're already super powerful. When will these people stop? Never, unless they are stopped by regular people that know this is madness.
Yeah, because you can't shame them. They have no moral.
No, they're all sociopaths and they're nuts. Yeah.
So let me ask you this: just every time I research this, I do one of these videos for my channel, I need to take a break and take a couple days. Like, how are you covering all of this? And you're a parent, and how are you dealing this just from a personal, emotional level and not letting it? Because I have days where I'm just like, oh, maybe it'd be good if climate collapse wipes out planet Earth because the human race is horrifying. Like, how do you deal with this as somebody that's just trying to get at the truth?
Well, I like to think of the fact that, I was just saying, these are the people in control. I have a 1.5-year-old kid. This is not the world I want for my daughter. I really refuse to let my kid grow up in a world that exploits and abuses children like this. If we can't protect the most vulnerable people in our society, and our authorities are actually trafficking and abusing those same kids, I mean, we can't go on like this as a world, as a society. This isn't just the United States. This was an international sex trafficking ring. It has ties to U.S. intelligence. It has ties to Israeli intelligence. Think of how many countries in the world are U.S. client states. Obviously, they're tied into this, and those kids are being exploited. This is just so insane to think about. That anyone that isn't outraged by this, I feel really bad for you. Maybe because you're numb, because of how much crappy shit goes on in the U.S. But we just can't. I just don't see how we can allow this to continue. So mainly, I get over how grossed out I am and how sick this makes me by the fact that I'm so angry that this is going on, and I need it to stop. just so, not just for my kid, but for other kids. And, I was a victim of sexual assault. I was raped, but I was like 23. I can't imagine what these girls went through when they were like, some of them were 12. This guy was getting kids as young as 8 years old. I mean, imagine those poor girls growing into adults and what they have to go through and carry the rest of their lives because of the sick, not just Epstein, who was a sick man, but the sick network and the sick, ruling class that perpetuates this and profits from this and has done it for decades. I mean, screw these guys.
I had a similar conversation. I was like, because I was abused, when I was 3 by a woman, and I think it's nothing compared to being trafficked for like age whatever, 8 or 10 through 20 something. Like, I can't even imagine. I mean,
yeah, they were stuck there for years, a lot of these girls, and they had to do this every day. And this is in the United States. Yeah. This was slavery.
Yes, this is slavery. This is slavery. This is like, and it's important to get the language correct. Like, I did an interview with a child crimes investigator, and he brought up an excellent point. He said, Graham, when I worked in Vice, I was a beat cop and I did Vice, and we called it prostitution and nobody cared. When we started changing the language to, this is human trafficking, these prostitutes have been trafficked, then everybody started to kind of wake up. People used to go, oh, prostitution's a victimless crime. These women are choosing this. It's their body, and it was like, And when he said the language changed, people started to wake up. And I think it's kind of important what you're doing, what I and others are doing in this independent media space is just keep and calling the language what it is. She's not a gal pal.
Yeah.
She's a sex trafficking.
Hell no, she is not a gal pal. No, she's like the worst of the worst. He called these girls that she had helped enslaved trash and said they were nothing when she was taking them around to these elite parties. I mean, throw this woman in prison.
Yeah, that's a kind response.
Yeah.
So, well, I really appreciate you taking time to come on the show, and I appreciate the work that you're doing. It's important, and so for everybody out there watching, I will put a link to where do you have a website for people to go to, or?
Well, all my work right now can be found at mintpressnews.com. I write exclusively for them. You can follow Mint Press News on Twitter and Facebook. I'm only on Twitter at _Whitney Webb. You can follow me there.
All right. So I'll put everybody watching the show, I'll put Mint Press News. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. So you can find this 3-part series, and there's going to be a 4th part coming out soon, right?
Yeah, hopefully this week.
Okay, cool. I don't want to put any more pressure on you with a deadline. I'm sure you've got enough.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much for being on the show, and we really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about this, the right way.
It is. So everybody out there watching, please like, subscribe, share these videos, get this word out. You can support what I'm doing because, again, people like Whitney, people like myself, we don't have big major multinational conglomerates financing us. So I have a Patreon link below. I have a Rockfin link below. There's a lot of great ways to support what I'm doing. I have live tour dates. All of that is at GrahamElwood.com. Thank you so much, Whitney, and thank you, everybody, for watching.
Thanks.